Welcome back.
Now, I want to kind of finish up this job order cost system by kind of doing, just a couple of more events just to finish it up and wrap this example up. Let's assume that in fact we completed the production. And we did this on January 15th, production of job number 351, the 5 oak tables. And that in fact we then take these tables and we transfer them to an area where we keep all of the finished goods. And so we'll put it into finished goods, but not only are we going to do that physically, we have to do it from an accounting standpoint because we are keeping track of the flow of these manufacturing overhead costs through the stages of inventory. These tables are no longer in process. They're done. So we're going to credit work in process inventory at the cost of $4,316 and debit finished goods inventory for the same $4,316. Now, not only are the tables in the right physical place, but we've also matched that by adjusting our accounting records to show the movement of all of those costs into the finished goods inventory. And then next, let's assume that one of these oak chairs that we produced here with job number 351 and is sitting there in finished goods inventory waiting for sale is actually sold to a customer on account at a price of $1,400. See, we weren't so dumb. We didn't sell it for $700. The pricing to our customers is $1,400 for one of these tables. Well, if we sell it to a customer on account for $1,400, we're going to debit accounts receivable because they owe us now for $1,400 and credit sales revenues for $1,400 to reflect the sales price. But we will also credit finished goods inventory for 1 unit. Well, what was the cost of this 1 unit? Where do you figure that out? Where do you get that information? Because you've got to credit finished goods inventory and debit cost of goods sold for the cost of one of these tables. Where do you get that information? The job cost sheet, that job cost record. See, that's why I told you that in a job order cost system, that job cost sheet is the core of the accounting system. It is there where we accumulate the costs of our product, all of our product costs, materials, labor, and overhead, job by job. So in making this entry, we will refer to our job cost record or sheet and discover that the amount of that one table is $863.20 per table. And so now we know the amount of the credit to finished goods inventory and the debit to cost of goods sold. Now, you'll remember that we've been maintaining a manufacturing overhead account. Let's go back and in fact look at that T account called manufacturing overhead, which was this account where we were it's a holding account, that temporary account, where we were putting all of the actual costs of our indirect materials, our indirect labor, the supervisory salary, and other overhead costs, utility bills, and depreciation of equipment. We were putting all of the actual costs here into manufacturing overhead as debits to this holding account until we figured out how to take those costs out of there and apply it to work in process on a job-by-job basis. And by the way, when we do take those costs out of there, out of manufacturing overhead, and put it into work in process, we are going to be crediting manufacturing overhead and debiting work in process, and we're going to be doing it based upon that predetermined overhead rate. In this particular example, $15.20 times every direct labor hour incurred on the different jobs will be how we in fact determine the amount of the credit to manufacturing overhead and debit to work in process. At the end of any accounting period, once we've got all of the actual manufacturing overhead costs, after we have applied all of this manufacturing overhead cost then to work in process at $15 and at the rate of $15.20 per the direct labor hours incurred on each of the jobs. Theoretically, we would hope that this would end up with an ending balance equal to zero. This is not an asset, liability, owner's equity, revenue, expense, dividend. It was an account that we temporarily set up to accumulate all these costs until we could figure out how to apply them to work in process. And now that we've applied them to work in process, it should be zero. because we were just holding them until we could apply. So theoretically, we want to take, or hope to have taken out, all of these overhead costs and put them into work in process. But the fact of the matter is that it rarely comes to a zero balance. The reason for that is that predetermined overhead rate of $15.20 was predicated upon budgeted, what we expected our overhead costs to be over the next month, and what we thought our direct labor hours would be over the next month. And the fact of the matter is that $15.20, based on budgets for the future, may not have been the ultimate true rate given our actual manufacturing overhead costs in that following month and our actual direct labor hours over the following month. And if in fact actual costs are higher or lower than we budgeted, and our direct labor hours were more or less than we budgeted, we probably are going to end up with some kind of a balance here. If in fact we end up with a debit balance, all that means is that we had more actual overhead costs than we actually applied then to work in process. Well, we would refer to a debit balance at the end of an accounting period in manufacturing overhead as a representation of an under-application of overhead to work in process. See, if we have a debit balance, it means that our actual costs in total exceeded how much we've applied to work in process. And ultimately, we want to take all of our costs and apply it to work in process. So we have under-applied it. If in fact you have a debit balance at the end of any accounting period representing the fact that you didn't apply enough to work in process, you will be forced or need to make an adjusting entry to this manufacturing overhead account because it needs to be zero. It's just a temporary holding account. It's not an asset, liability owner's equity. It should not have a balance. We're going to clean it out. Well, if we've got a debit balance as a result of an under-application and we're going to clean it out, we're going to need to make an adjusting entry that requires that we credit this manufacturing overhead by the amount of the debit balance, the under-application. We're going to have to credit it and effectively apply more here at the end to kind of fix it, to get the balance to go to zero. Well, so what I'm suggesting here is that if we've had an under-application and have a debit balance in manufacturing overhead, we're going to need to make an adjusting entry to credit manufacturing overhead to apply some more, get the rest of it out of there, and apply that remaining amount to work in process inventory. Well, but here's the problem. Yes, we're going to credit manufacturing overhead by the amount of that debit balance or under application. And theoretically, we would want to debit work in process for the same amount, work in process inventory. We wanted to apply more to work in process inventory. But the problem here is that most of that work in process inventory that we were working on during the month, probably most of it has been finished and transferred, all of the costs transferred to finished goods inventory. Well, if that's true, then what we want to do is take these under applications and apply more, but don't put it in work in process because those costs are already sitting now in finished goods inventory. So maybe what we should do is debit a little bit to work in process, but most of it to finished goods inventory, because that's where those costs are, or where those units that were produced are. And since we under applied it to the work in process as it was being built, we need to now increase the amount of overhead that we applied to it because we under applied it during the period. We need to apply more to that inventory at this point in time. But most of that inventory is in finished goods. But you know what? I'm going to guess that most of the finished goods inventory that was worked on during the period and work in process, then transferred to finished goods, all of those costs, I'll bet most of those costs are now sitting in cost of goods sold, because we've probably sold most of the stuff furniture that we've manufactured, finished, and now we've sold it. So really, I suppose what we should do is take some of these costs and say, gee, our work in process should have been a little higher, but most of that's in finished goods now, so maybe finished goods should be a little higher. But most of the finished goods has been sold, so maybe really what we're saying is that cost of goods sold should be a little higher. In fact, maybe most of the product has been sold, so maybe most of this under-application really should be to cost of goods sold. Well, typically this amount of under-application here is usually fairly small, hopefully fairly immaterial. And so what we'll do is in most cases, in trying to figure out, rather than figuring out how much should be applied to work in process that's still there, finished goods that's still there, or cost of goods sold that's been sold, what we'll probably do is, since we will assume that most of that stuff has been finished and sold, what we'll probably do is, it's not that material, just credit manufacturing overhead and debit cost of goods sold. Let's look back at the manufacturing overhead account and make a different assumption. Let's assume for a moment that in fact our applications to work in process, the credit to manufacturing overhead, as we put these manufacturing overhead costs into the cost of work in process, actually exceeded our actual manufacturing overhead costs. You know, this might have happened because our actual manufacturing overhead costs were actually turned out to be less than what we had budgeted in the determination of our predetermined overhead rate. But at any rate, whatever the reason for it is, we have credited manufacturing overhead for more than we've had in terms of debits to actual costs, leaving us with a credit balance in this manufacturing overhead account at the end of the period. Well, again, this manufacturing overhead account is just a temporary holding account and has to be cleaned out. And so it needs to, what we have here is we would have a credit balance, and this credit balance actually represents an over-application. If we've over-applied, put more manufacturing overhead costs into work in process, and as a result, we put more manufacturing overhead costs into the work in process that's been completed, which are finished goods, and most of those finished goods have been sold, then in order to adjust this account, we're going to have to debit manufacturing overhead and theoretically credit cost of goods sold to clean this account out and to adjust for the fact that we had put too much cost in to the cost of our inventory.